thanks to Jenny and her team at York for Life for inviting me to give this talk this evening as part of Mental Health Awareness Week. So, yeah, as Scott said, my background is in neuroscience, but my current interest is in stress and trying to understand stress, really fundamentally kind of linked to how it impacts the body and how our biology remembers stress, and also ways that we can help us manage stress in our lives. So in this talk, I'm hoping that I will kind of elaborate and give you some more information about what stress is and what we understand about stress in terms of what's going on in the body, but then also, how we might best take action to find balance in helping us deal with stress, which is a very kind of individual approach, really. So let's get started. So just for that context then, Mental Health Awareness Week is this week, and it's the Mental Health Foundation that kind of advocates this Mental Health Awareness Week, and there's loads of stuff on their website. This year's theme is action, which is partly why I've chosen to address that in my talk, for yourself, for someone else, for all of us, and there's just a little QR code there onto the website. They said that there's top 10 actions. I had a little look on the website to see what the Mental Health Foundation are kind of advocating in terms of action. Does it overlap a little bit with kind of my thoughts around how we can deal with stress? And they talk about top 10 actions and simple actions that may lift mood and improve ability to cope with life. And that kind of, thinking about actually what coping is, thinking about what stress reduction techniques are, is a good way to think about it, I think. What is it that we put in place to be able to balance the challenges that we have? So this is just a kind of very brief snapshot of what those 10 are. You might look kind of very quickly over those. You might find something that you think, oh yeah, I do that already, or oh no, I don't think, that would be something, getting creative, for example, is there something there that I do? You can see that mindfulness is in there. So that's very nice. We'll be focusing on that later on. But all of these really, to me, speak to that, it's about kind of alleviating stress, and it's also about finding the right thing for you as a person. So, you can combine these things, but really the way that we do that is very individual. And so it is around kind of thinking about awareness of who we are, what we best benefit from. And much of this is because, as Scott said, there is real severe kind of mental health challenges and difficulties internationally and in the UK. This was a report on stress. Are we coping? This was actually a 2018 report, so pre-pandemic, and it was a survey conducted by the Mental Health Foundation of 4,619 UK. It had UK respondents, and it found that 74%, so 3/4 of people, had felt overwhelmed or unable to cope due to stress in the past year. Some of the causes that were listed, and again, there's a QR code there if you're interested in reading the full report, were long-term health conditions, debt, so money worries, and real money issues, housing worries, feeling external social pressures. And then you see then that it's related then to behaviours. So the behavioural effects that people were reporting were eating unhealthily, almost half of people, and that might kind of ring true to you. You might think, for some people, they either eat too much when they're stressed, they might eat too little when they're stressed. Impacts on sleep as well, impacts on drinking. So some people will drink more when they're stressed, and smoking as well. Some people will start smoking even if they've given up for years following a stressful event. So are we coping, as a question? No, we're not coping very well. And much of that is to do with how stressed people are feeling. There was a newer report. So this came out in January 2026, called the Burnout Report, that's conducted each year by Mental Health UK. This is a similar sized survey across the UK and found that 91% of adults experienced high or extreme levels of pressure or stress, that 20% have taken time off work. So, these links in terms of kind of burnout and stress, and 39% in 18 to 24. So actually that younger adult age group are taking more time off due to stress. Some of the drivers for that at work were listed as being workload, unpaid overtime, and job security. And then drivers outside work were always also listed as well. So poor sleep, poor physical health, and money worries. So again, that kind of interaction, the way that we are operating at work is really related to what's going on outside of work as well. So thinking about that balance. So it's very, very easy to think that stress is everywhere. I worked with an artist, Pearl Hudson, as part of a kind of artist-scientist collaboration a couple of years ago. And she did this painting for me, which now sits in my office, which was to capture some of that feeling of stress and some of those drivers behind what makes people feel stress. So definitely you can see there's that kind of internal experience, but also there's some real external situations, housing insecurity, war, and time pressures, and all of these kind of things often that we feel that we're balancing that can feel too much. So I think she captured that kind of feeling really well. But actually, stress can be very difficult to define. I've taken this picture from the image that was taken to advertise this talk, because I did think it kind of showed actually sometimes we don't know what's causing people stress. We might have a sense that people are feeling stressed and maybe burnt out. And different people will show that in different ways, for example, anxiety, depression. But there can be so many things going on internally that can be causing us stress as well. So that perception is really key. So I thought we'd start with defining stress. And to do this, I've gone right back to Hooke's law. So this was an engineering term, actually, that was defined as the strain of an elastic object is proportional to the stress applied to it. So stress in this situation is kind of how much tension a spring can take. It's been used then and moved into everyday language to represent kind of the wear and tear of everyday life. And Walter Cannon was a really famous stress researcher in 1932 who coined the term homeostasis. So this is the fact that the body likes to balance itself. It needs to keep itself regulated. So we need to keep it at a constant temperature in order for kind of things to operate in our bodies as efficiently as possible. And homeostasis is the way that our body tries to do that. He also coined the term fight or flight, which is that kind of reaction that we have to a stressor where we get kind of in this position of ready to run away or fight. That uses kind of energy. It's an adaptation, so it is kind of homeostasis in that it's then adapting, but then we're wanting to then rebalance afterwards. So what happens when we're stressed, when we're having this fight or flight response? Of course, it involves the brain. And there is a really kind of complex, there's two main systems that are involved in this. So there's the cortisol system. So you will have heard of cortisol as one of the main stress hormones. And there's also adrenaline. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is what controls the release of cortisol. Very much depends on that. On a stressor being perceived by the brain and then kind of releasing these hormones into the bloodstream that then trigger release of cortisol. And then these cortisol molecules can go all around the body, and they are there really to release energy. So they're in the liver, it's converting glycogen to glucose. That's giving us increased energy, increases blood pressure, increased sweating. Our breathing will get faster, we oxygenating, accelerated heart rates, and digestion slows down. So this is a combined effort by the sympathetic nervous system, which is releasing adrenaline, and the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is releasing cortisol. But there's a bit of a paradox with stress. So yes, we have this reaction. We've perceived something as being stressful. We have this response. We've got cortisol being released. We've got adrenaline being released. And it has all of these impacts on the body. And then what we're hoping is once the stressor goes away, so once we no longer feel that we're under threat, then that all goes back to how it was, nice and calm again. But actually, not all stress is bad. So there is, and we'll identify with this as well, this kind of optimal arousal level. So if we think of this system as being to do with kind of arousal level, we want our production, our performance to be as good as it can be. And we want to be interested in what we're doing. We want to be a bit excited sometimes, but we don't want to be so stressed that we're unproductive. If we're too stressed, then our concentration will be impacted, we'll become indecisive, and we'll have a decrease in performance due to this increased stress and anxiety. This is known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. These were two psychologists working in 1908. And this is describing this state of where actually if you're under stressed, you can be quite unmotivated and bored. This optimal stress level is where we want to be. We want to be creative, productive, motivated, focused, and in the zone. We don't want to be overstressed. So we've got this kind of inverted U curve. So some stress is good. And what we perceive as being stressful does depend on the individual. It depends on our experience previously as to whether or not we think that flying is really, really stressful, for example. Some people have severe phobia about flying. There might be stressful events in the internally in our body that we find individually incredibly stressful. And then also stressful events that we retrieve in our memories based on previous experiences. And all of this can lead to vulnerability or resilience in the way that we perceive challenges in the environment. And this can impact on our regulation strategies, whether or not we avoid something that we are perceiving or experiencing in the environment, our cognitive performance, so whether or not how we experience the event in terms of re-experiencing or decreasing or increasing in learning and memory, and then physiologically as well. So some of the work in my lab is around measuring heart rate, increases in response to stress, and cortisol release. And much of what this perceptive process, part of what the perceptive process, is to do with the prefrontal cortex, which is really core. This is the frontal region of our brain. It's very good at focusing attention and regulating emotion, but it's not very good at doing it in severe stress. But again, it depends on the person in terms of what that severe stress is. So when we're alert, when we're feeling kind of really in control, then we'll have strong prefrontal cortex, top-down control. So this is the relationship with emotion centers in our brain, such as the amygdala, for example. If we're tired and very stressed, then we'll have weak prefrontal cortex, top-down control, and so we'll be less able to self-regulate and make potentially poorer decisions as well. And so I like to think about it with these kind of weighing scales. So thinking about that, the body is always trying to be in balance. And these are these terms, homeostasis. And there's another term here, which is allostasis. And allostasis is where your body is trying to adapt to what you're experiencing in the environment. And so in reality, we're hardly ever stable, right? We're kind of always kind of going up a little bit or then going back down again and trying to kind of balance. If we have too much, too much stress, then we can kind of visualize this as depleting the body's ability to rebalance. So a little bit like padlocks on a scale, it's going to be really, really hard to pull ourselves back up into that kind of homeostasis that we were in before. And then the body can get really out of balance. And we know that chronic stress can cause this kind of out of balance situation, and this has been termed allostatic load. So allostasis, this ability to adapt, so stability through change, and then allostatic load, which is when we were unable to kind of balance back to a baseline, were terms that were really pioneered by Bruce McEwen, another really famous stress researcher. And this was the model that he kind of proposed, where we're thinking about what this allostasis is. So really thinking about actually what we're doing as we're kind of engaging with the world is adapting to what we are, to the events that are happening around us, and that the actions that we choose to do. And lots of things will impact on these. So environmental stresses, of course, our environment will affect our perception of threat. Major life events will also impact, and trauma and abuse. So some of my research looks at how adverse childhood events can impact on the way that we perceive stress, but also our cortisol systems in adulthood. We also have individual differences in terms of genetics, our experiences, and this will all impact on the perception of stress and impact on our behavioural responses. So these together, we can think about allostasis as being adaptation, trying to kind of get stability through change that is very kind of positive. But if that becomes overwhelmed, then it can lead to increased allostatic load. And we know that this is related to poor health in terms of cardiovascular disease and other physical health conditions, but also mental health as well. So I'm going to show you some figures now, and hopefully they're kind of quite straightforward, but I'm happy to talk through them again if anyone's interested. So this is what we want, okay? So we want to experience, when we have a challenge and we perceive something to be stressful, we want to have a reaction. So this is just listed as a generic physiological response. We can think of it as cortisol. And then we want to recover again. So really important that we manage to kind of recover back to the baseline in an ideal world, okay? So this gives you an example here then of where you get repeated kind of stresses, and you've got this reaction to stress, and then coming back down again to a kind of baseline, so recovery. And each time this person in this situation is recovering really well. But if you carry on experiencing stress, so it becomes very chronic, then the body will not be able to adapt to that stress very effectively long term. And actually, in some cases, then after a prolonged response, you have a very heightened release of cortisol, for example, all the time. That has been shown as happening in some cases, and that can mean that it's very difficult to respond and recover to stress. And then also, over time, you can experience exhaustion, which means that actually the system kind of crashes a little bit, and you have very low cortisol. So we know short-term release of cortisol is protective and adaptive, and long-term release can lead to immunosuppression and a host of mental health, physical disorders, and exhaustion. So I think this is a kind of useful way to think about, our bodies and what might be going on, and maybe kind of learning to listen a little bit to what our bodies are telling us. And daily cortisol release can be an indicator of chronic stress. So some of what I do in the lab is look at what's called the cortisol awakening response. So this is a natural rise in cortisol that happens in the morning. And this is because cortisol is released throughout the day. And you can see this pattern that links to a kind of inverse of melatonin release. So you have cortisol release during the day. and then kind of rises again until you wake up in the morning. And melatonin, almost kind of the opposite. You have increased melatonin at night. So there is with this relationship here a little bit with sleep, although sleep's not my kind of main area of expertise at all. But there is this relationship, of course, that we know between stress and sleep, and some of that is to do with those physiological changes that we see when people are under stress. So the morning cortisol awakening response is this first. There's a little rise in the morning that you can measure in the first hour, and we looked at the impact of childhood adversity. This was in an adult male sample, and whether or not we could see differences in the cortisol awakening response in adulthood. So we asked questions. This was retrospectively about their experiences in childhood, and found that that those who had experienced trauma had increased cortisol awakening response. So they had increased release of cortisol release of cortisol in the morning in comparison to those who didn't experience early life stress. And you can see that that was also kind of linked in terms of how many types of trauma they reported experiencing. And we also looked just to see if there was a difference in terms of age, and it looks like potentially that there is an impact of developmental timing in terms of when a person might experience the adversity in terms of impact on cortisol in adulthood. I should say these were healthy adults, so they were screened for psychiatric disorders. So they weren't diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder or taking medication. So these were healthy adults. And we also know that genetics and stage of life are also important. So I'm not going to talk about this study too much, but I just wanted to show an example of this, because sometimes it's nice to look longitudinally, and also to think about the fact that sometimes risk can be present at particular age groups, and then maybe the risk dies down and becomes less as time goes on. And in our research, we found that age 15 seemed to be a particularly vulnerable age when you look at, in this case, we were looking at a dopamine gene variation, and whether or not that interacted with the experience of trauma in childhood or not. So the trauma group were in black there. And this was a reported, this was an impulsivity score, so maladaptive impulsivity, which can be linked to risk-taking behaviours and mental health as well. So this just to show really that genetics and stage of life are also important in terms of how our kind of cognitive processes develop in relation to adversity. So I thought it would be useful at this stage to put a checkpoint in place. So this is just to summarize that first section then. So really what I'm saying is that some stress is good, but too much is not. And you know, getting that balance, I think, is really the key thing. Our bodies are in a constant state of change aimed at rebalancing. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. You know, we're not built really to have this kind of stable state. We're always kind of adapting to our environment. Our past influences our stress physiology and cognitive processes. So, you know, we are built to adapt, and this, as we go through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, that is what our bodies are trying to do. So if we know all of this, how can we work to help find healthy balance, choose actions wisely, and cope with events in our lives? And I can't answer all of those questions. There are lots of people who have written a lot of books on different psychological tools that can help us take action to find balance. This was just a few of the kind of books that are around thinking about how you kind of build resilience, reasons why the tools that you might be able to use. So for example, some of the examples of these are finding meaning and purpose, choosing to challenge yourself to build adaptive responses, seeking social support, and then kind of cognitive behavioral therapy approaches such as reframing negative thought patterns. So working kind of actively to reframe those negative thought patterns. But what I've chosen to talk about, I've chosen to focus on today in this kind of second smaller part of my talk is mindfulness. And to think of mindfulness as an action, I think it's often viewed maybe as being quite passive, it looks like maybe people aren't doing very much when they're being mindful, but that it really is actually a conscious action and that it can help us to find balance. So what is mindfulness? It's a present moment awareness without judgment. And it's that last without judgment part that I think is really key. Mindfulness practice has been shown to enhance attention, improve emotion regulation, and reduce stress, and also impact neural circuitry related to self-awareness. So that prefrontal cortex region of the brain that I mentioned earlier in relation to perception of stress and appraisal. So thinking about whether or not you can cope with the challenges that you have in your environment, or external or internal. It has been shown that mindfulness can help with the prefrontal cortex. And I think I've included this image because I think this is often what people think of when they think of someone being mindful. But is it really this peaceful? And I think often, no, it's not. There's a lot of things in our minds when we close our eyes. And actually, it can be quite challenging to do mindfulness practice. But it is a tool to increase awareness of, all those things that are going on inside us. And it has been shown to have these kind of three components, really, so that it can help build attentional control, emotional regulation, and that self-awareness, and that these collectively can help to improve self-regulation. And it can also impact on our body. So we've been talking about physiology, we've been talking about cortisol in this talk, and there has been some evidence that shows that mindfulness practice can help reduce cortisol. It can increase heart rate variability. So heart rate variability is the amount that your heart rate varies, and high heart rate variability has been shown to be very positive and allow us to kind of cope with stress perhaps better than low heart rate variability. Reduce pain, increase immune system activity, and again enhance prefrontal cortex function. So building that relationship with our bodies that sometimes maybe become quite separate from our awareness. So I've nearly finished my talk, but I wanted to kind of use this example in the last one of my last slides, which and I think there is a lot to be kind of taken from these kind of athletes that have quite extreme have really quite extreme achievements. I think the mental training that they have to do is quite kind of significant. I don't know if you know this person, Laura Crane. She managed to surf a 60-foot wave in Portugal, which is just absolutely, unimaginable. But in preparing for it, I was reading an article about her, and in preparing for it, she said it involved months of breath and strength training. But the most important thing, she said, was teaching my mind to remain calm in incredibly stressful situations. So I thought that was a really kind of nice way to think of actually there can be huge turmoil. This can be, in your mind, in what it is that you're doing, and actually remaining calm, is possible. I also think it's nice to think about that kind of balance. So the weighing scales, thinking about how events, we're constantly kind of adapting and then recovering. It's also a bit like kind of waves coming in to a beach. So in summary, adaptation to challenge involves understanding, I believe, how we cope with the pressure it will bring, but also how we can recover. So that acknowledging that even if we have coped with something, recovery is really key. And sometimes that can take time. Mindfulness can help us increase our understanding of our own individual needs, and practice is key to enable us to take the right action to find balance most effectively when under pressure. So to bring it back then to the Mental Health Awareness Week and the theme of action for yourself, for someone else, and for all of us, taking action involves awareness in order to ensure we take the right action for us. So, not everything is going to work. We're all different. We've all had different experiences in our lives that will be impacting how we cope with different stresses and what we find stressful. What works for one person might not work for another. And I just wanted to end with saying, enjoy finding what works for you. So thanks very much. Thanks for listening and for joining on this very nice sunny evening. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kyla. That was a really wonderful talk. Absolutely fascinating stuff. And really, really interesting. And I'm sure people got a lot out of that talk. So as Kyla mentioned, we've got around about 23 minutes for questions, so a decent amount of time to get through some. I can see that one has come up in the Q&A, but we've got a couple prepared already from that people sent in. So what I'd like to ask you first, Kyla, is a question that we got from Marta, which I think is a really, really interesting question about how we can actually use tools for supporting ourselves when we're experiencing stress. So what Marta has asked is, what can I do to make it easier to help myself in times of stress? When I'm not stressed, I have good ideas of what might help me to cope with stress better, but I struggle to access this sort of help when I'm not stressed.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and thanks, Marta, for asking that question. I think it's a great question, and it because really what that's about is the fact that when we're not stressed, we know all the things we need to do to not be stressed. But when something happens, almost all that might go out the window. So we often know what to do when we to help ourselves when we're in more balanced states. When we get to that time of overwhelm and burnout, we find ourselves doing things that we know won't help, and that kind of speaks to that burnout report where people and the stress report at the beginning, where people will often kind of drink more when they're feeling stressed. They might start smoking again, even if they've stopped smoking for years. That's really, really hard. I guess the thing is to try and have things in place that are coping mechanisms that are so kind of built in, maybe as habit, that's your kind of go-to, but definitely not easy, and absolutely not something that is something, I guess, to kind of try it, that needs to just kind of be aspired to at all times.
Lovely, thank you, very good answer. Really interesting question here from Susan, which is all about the relationship between nature and nurture and how we experience stress. So Susan says that both their father and paternal grandmother suffered anxiety, and they don't always cope well with situations that cause them to feel stressed. Do you think anxiety can be inherited, or is it a learned behaviour, or is it perhaps both?
Yeah, so I think, it wasn't that long ago when there were still quite kind of polarized views on this, I think, in terms of nature or nurture. Is it something that's kind of purely genetic, or is it something that's just your environment? And I think now the evidence really is showing that it is a combined kind of interaction a lot of the time. So we inherit vulnerability. In mental health disorders, there will be increased susceptibility if you have relatives who have a diagnosed disorder, but some are quite often it's not specific to specific disorders. So you might see in families that they have different diagnoses, increased chances, but there's definitely also people in those families that won't develop psychiatric disorders. So yeah, it's really about kind of vulnerability and susceptibility, and the environment that you've experienced. But I guess that kind of learning about who you are and maybe what that vulnerability is, and learning kind of what coping strategies you need. And coping strategies, I think, can also be enjoyable, right? So I think, just kind of what helps for you, helps you. I should say that some of these susceptibility kind of genes that have been shown to be linked have also been shown to be linked to creativity. They've been shown to be linked to neuroplasticity. So some of the people that might be most at risk of these disorders might also, be able to recover and also be kind of highly creative.
Great, thank you, Kyla. So we've had a couple of questions come through in the Q&A about mindfulness. How you would define mindfulness, and what's the best way to practice it?
Yes, I do realise that I didn't do any kind of practice of mindfulness in this session. I think it is quite a personal thing. I think there's been quite a lot of evidence for these kind of 8-week programs. I suppose first of all, I could define it. I think I did define it in one of my earlier slides, didn't I? Which I took, the definition that I took was Jon Kabat-Zinn's, so I should have referenced him really. So Jon Kabat-Zinn, who kind of really brought the kind of Western idea of mindfulness away from that more Buddhist tradition of meditation, and he defined it as mindfulness is present moment awareness without judgment. And so there's lots of activities where you can practice mindfulness, where it doesn't necessarily mean that you're kind of sitting as this person here, kind of meditating in front of a mountain. There's lots of ways that you can be mindful. So some practices, some people have mindful walking. You can have mindful eating, but there's also lots of kind of led practices that you can find on apps such as the Headspace app, for example, or courses that you can join where you have really experienced practitioners. Some of the best evidence, I think, is around 8-week programs, which I was mentioning earlier, where they take you on a kind of journey of exploration of your in terms of mindfulness. So you'll gain kind of different kind of experiences with different practices, which I think can be really useful. Also, whether or not you kind of practice on your own or in a group, there is some evidence that kind of the group practice can be really beneficial, but very mixed for in school settings.
Thank you. Very comprehensive. So in the questions that were sent in previously, there were a few people that understandably have asked questions about stress related to the workplace, given that I think a number of sectors are experiencing pressures with reduced numbers of staff, and that placing demands on people, and obviously that having an impact on stress levels. So there's been some I think the first part of this question is what we can do, what are the signs that we need to be aware of when stress is taking over in a workplace situation. And Victoria, for example, has given the example that their brain is often telling them that they're fine, but their body is responding to a high level of stress that they're not perhaps not consciously aware of. And related to that is this feeling of overwhelm. So Tony has asked a question about when you're feeling overwhelmed in your no matter the amount of time you have, it seems that meeting the objectives is impossible. So I guess I've given you an awful lot in a single question there, Kyla, but maybe if we just start with the first point of if we break that down, so what are the sort of key signs to be aware of, I guess, would be a starting point for that question.
Yeah, so I'm not. So I should say I'm not an occupational psychologist. I think lots of occupational psychologists are very experienced in workplace kind of stress and workplace burnout. But if we think about, what will be going on when we are getting to that point of overwhelm, and we're thinking about that kind of inverted U of in terms of kind of productivity, but also decision making. So our brains become kind of less able to do complex tasks that we might have managed really well, like multitasking, for example. You can it might be that we feel more emotional, we're not able to self-regulate as well as we normally would do in kind of meetings, for example, where there might be conflict or difficult situations. So I think to become aware of those subtle changes is important, and then to take time out where possible. So yeah, definitely with the acknowledgement that workplaces and workload might be feeling incredibly pressured for lots of people, and so it might not feel that people are able to take the time that they need. But I think then it does need to be that we don't have a workforce that is at the level of kind of needing to work at high activity as we are maybe feeling that we're expected to be. So, but to think about, there are things that we can do in ourselves to kind of, maybe not feel the expectation quite so much, or to step away from it a little bit, make sure we take some time off, make sure, we don't log into emails all the time, all through, flexible working, I think, is very, very difficult in terms of impacting on our ability to separate between home life and work life. But also to kind of, put it, kind of have, I think part of it is that, or part of what my talk was hopefully kind of getting across is that by building awareness in ourselves, we can also kind of understand what we might need in the workplace in order to be the best that we can be. And that is what we are, that is what employers want from us. So yeah, it's complicated, challenging. There should be, I guess there's times in some workplaces where there will be, more need for very kind of focused, kind of, high work levels, but there should then be times when there's not so much. So it should balance. If it's not balancing, then I guess the workplace, it does need to be a kind of environmental change, a structural change that happens. It's complicated, isn't it, Scott, in terms of thinking individual versus structural change.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, that problem is compounded when you have larger organizations, and it's difficult to manage those approaches effectively. But just related to that, I mean, when you're talking about structural changes, can you give some examples that you may be aware of that have been effective in reducing stress and improving productivity of employees across the board?
I wouldn't know research in that area, so I wouldn't want to speak. I wouldn't want to speak to an area that is not my expertise, Scott. So I do know that that institutions, organizations will bring in, things like mindfulness, things like kind of coaching, mentoring. These kinds of structures can help people feel really supported. So. I think having those kinds of structures in place will make people feel often less isolated, but also able to kind of work out how their workload might be able to be managed. I think there's a lot in. I'm not going to let. That's definitely not my my expertise. So
I think there's an interesting tension between the needs of companies to create a culture where people can manage their workloads and stress effectively, which is built on trust, but then unfortunately this tendency for a lot of organizations to completely embroil themselves in bureaucracy and administration, which means that, you know, people are spending an awful lot of time doing things that aren't necessarily that productive when, you know, the list of things that they really need to get done are mounting up. So I think it's you know, it's important. A key part of this is really on trust and actually just, you know, ensuring that people are trusted to, you know, manage their work effectively and do the things that they've been employed to do. So yeah, that's my little rant anyway. Let me just get back to these questions. So I think you kind of answered Tony's point as well about overwhelm and you know, how that stress can lead to you know, this feeling that there's never going to be enough time when, you know, that stress mounts up, and obviously that links to these, like you talked about, the prefrontal cortex being important for helping people to manage their you know, their emotions and the various challenges that they're facing around them in an effective and productive way. I guess.
Yeah, I guess just to add, then, yeah, it is about that there is power in the individual, I think, isn't there? You know, if we know kind of what we need and how we can do our jobs better, then I think, you know, you can bring that. So bringing awareness to needs around workload and the balance, you know, taking recovery time, but also monitoring how much of your time you feel is spent kind of in that recovery. So to find activities that you enjoy. Yeah, so it doesn't feel quite so much like recovery, but it is actually recharging as well.
Thank you. So there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A that really talk about focus on prevention. So taking steps to prevent stress from emerging rather than waiting until stress emerges before you try and tackle it. And, you know, this is really, I think, nicely linked with you know, the big plans that the government have for changing the way that the NHS operates, with focusing more on prevention than you know, reactivity and treatment. So yeah, could you speak to that a bit about strategies that could be used as preventative measures to you know, try and mitigate stress or stop stress in its tracks, and maybe how mindful measures might also relate to that, and maybe linking it into cortisol somewhat, if you can reduce cortisol when waking through mindfulness. Again, a lot to think about there. But,
yeah, so I guess the ideal would be that we are not operating at such a high kind of a high level of you know, fight or flight readiness all the time. So if we think about that kind of graph where, you know, someone's just kind of they're at a very high point, they've got high cortisol, they've got high adrenaline, and that's most of the time. The ability then for you to react and be able to deal with something that might, like a major life event, for example, which, you know, will happen to all of us at some stage in some shape or form, becomes really reduced then. And so then it doesn't, you know, that the kind of effect in terms of kind of our mental and physical health will be much bigger. So really what we want to do is try and kind of lower that cortisol for day-to-day living, like I do feel like, and I think I put it in the description, the kind of overview of the talk, that sometimes it's like we seek out, we're kind of in a pattern maybe of behavior where we're seeking out this kind of higher level of intensity of living, and actually that can kind of impair our ability to respond to stress in the long term, like kind of, you know, real stress. Maybe it's like we want to kind of be in this kind of optimal states, but maybe actually it seems to have shifted. It's like, actually, it seems to, you know, lots of people will kind of talk about how busy they are all the time, how stressed they're feeling. It's kind of normal to feel stressed, and actually if we can kind of maybe try and bring that baseline down a bit, we'd be able to deal with stress as a kind of, yeah, more effectively. That would be the ideal. So I guess then it's about building in practices that can do that, right? So that you're activating. So I talked about the sympathetic nervous system, so the fight or flight response. The kind of opposite to that is the parasympathetic system, so our rest or digest. And mindfulness has been shown to enhance that, but also other activities as well. Interestingly, is there are activities, and it was a bit kind of on the action list as well for the Mental Health Foundation, that include kind of exercise. Exercise can be stressful, but it can also be really stress relieving. So there was a balance there as well about how much exercise you might do that will challenge your body, but then allow you to kind of recover. And actually that increase activity and kind of stressor, physical stressor, and then recovery can also build that adaptation, I think, to enable you to kind of have resilience.
Absolutely. And yeah, certainly don't exercise too close to bedtime.
But also, sometimes when people are kind of, I don't know, training for marathon, there's certain kind of challenges where it will start to impact, and it will impact sleep as well, doesn't it? I think, Scott, you'll know.
Yeah,
I think because you're stressing your body. Is that?
Yeah, well, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, with changes in cortisol, that will impact on your sleep, and I've had personal experience of that from training for a marathon, and being suffering from acute insomnia as a result of very long runs and the stress response. So it's you can certainly overdo it in terms of exercise. So finding that balance is important. And I think we've got time for one last question, which is a really interesting one. So you're going to have to try and answer this in 3 minutes, Kyla, which is maybe a bit of a challenge, but I think it's a good challenge. So it says, in the study that you cited, is there any known reason as to why the age 15 is a particularly vulnerable age?
Thank you. Yes. So I did, that longitudinal study, they kind of took cross-sectionally the same people aged 15 and then age 18 and then age 24. And we know that the prefrontal cortex is the last kind of region of the brain to mature, and it's maturing through adolescence. And so part of the reason why we think adolescent mental health is a time of vulnerability in terms of mental health is partly to do with that, is partly to do with the fact that the prefrontal cortex is still developing. And so that ability to kind of self-regulate is not as mature as it is in kind of the more mature brain. And so it could be then that so what I showed there was the impulsivity, and in combination with the dopamine gene and trauma. So that combination can lead to that maladaptive impulsivity, which has been linked to things like risk taking, which we know in adolescence can be more prevalent. So that's I think a really great question, and kind of it would be another talk, but is really interesting, I think, to think about what is going on in adolescence. Also in that research, we did show that parental warmth, so there was some positive affective environment as well. So actually, in some cases, some of these things can be mitigated by the environment, which is nice, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyla. So we've run out of time for questions. We're at 7:59 p.m. And I'd just like to thank you again, Kyla, for a really exciting and fascinating talk. And I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope the audience have too. Really, really brilliant work. Thank you, Kyla. I'm just going to hand over to Jenny, who's got some final words before we finish the session.
Yeah, just kind of echoing what Scott was saying. Thank you so much for that talk, Kyla. Really, really interesting. And I think, I don't know, for me personally, I always feel a lot of, I guess, guilt around stress, the guilt around the fact that I'm stressed, but it's a bodily function, it's normal. And that's actually understanding some of the science behind that is quite reassuring, that, everybody is experiencing similar, and that is your body trying to cope with the situation. So yeah, I thought it was really, really good to know. So thank you so much, and thanks Scott for moderating that. It was really helpful. So yes, thank you both, and thank you to everybody who came today. Hopefully it was really interesting, and fingers crossed we'll see you at another event really soon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.